On the backroads of rural Pennsylvania, where the streetlights fade and the trees form an oppressive tunnel of darkness, there's a story that generations have whispered. It begins as a dare among teenagers, a challenge to drive to the old Koppel tunnel after midnight and turn off your headlights. Some say you'll see him, a glowing figure standing in the distance, his faceless head tilted as if he's studying you. Others say you'll hear him, a low hum growing louder, shaking your car windows until you can't take it anymore. And a few never return at all. They call him Charlie No-Face. The legend varies depending on who tells it. Some say he was a man disfigured in a tragic accident, left to wander the roads where he met his fate. Others claim he's not human at all, a specter or an entity born of something humanity shouldn't have tampered with. But in every version, one detail is the same: he has no face. The first recorded account dates back to the 1950s, when a group of teenagers dared to drive into the Koppel tunnel late at night. Only 2 of them returned. They claimed their car had stalled inside the tunnel, and in the suffocating darkness, they heard a strange hum. Then, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a figure without features, walking slowly toward them. They ran, leaving the car behind. When the vehicle was recovered the next day, its interior was charred, and its windows had melted into warped sheets of glass. Stories like this spread quickly, and soon, Charlie No-Face became a local legend. Parents warned their children not to wander near the tunnel, and truck drivers refused to take the route after sundown. But the legend didn't stop the curious. Adventurers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers flocked to the area, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous figure. In the decades since, sightings have continued. Witnesses described the same glowing form, the same faceless head, and the same unrelenting hum that seems to burrow into your bones. But more disturbing are the patterns that emerge. Electrical disturbances, charred remains, and a lingering sense of unease that doesn't fade even after leaving the area. Some say Charlie No-Face is just a myth, an exaggeration of a real-life tragedy. But for those who have encountered him, the truth is far more terrifying. And for the small, dying town of Koppel, the legend is more than a story. It's a shadow that refuses to fade. But recently, something has changed. The sightings are more frequent, and the disappearances more alarming. A young boy, last seen riding his bike near the tunnel, vanished without a trace. A truck driver found his vehicle stalled on Route 351. His dashboard electronics fried and his hands shaking as he described a figure watching him from the woods. And just last week, a family reported seeing a glowing figure standing at the edge of their yard, staring silently at their home before vanishing into the night. The hum is back, louder than ever, and Charlie No-Face is waiting. Koppel was the kind of town you'd miss if you blinked while driving through it. Tucked away in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, its streets were lined with crumbling storefronts, boarded-up homes, and rusting cars left to rot in overgrown driveways. Once a bustling community fueled by industry, the town had withered into near oblivion, its population dwindling year by year. But for the people who remained, Koppel held a darker reputation. One whispered in hushed tones at the diner or murmured in passing at the gas station. For decades, locals had spoken of Charlie No-Face, the faceless figure who haunted the roads and tunnels near town. Some dismissed the stories as a relic of small-town superstition, but others spoke with the weight of experience, their voices trembling as they recounted their own encounters. The legend had always cast a shadow over Koppel, but recent events had brought it back into the spotlight. The missing boy, the truck driver's harrowing account, and the strange, unexplained hum that seemed to follow those who dared venture near the tunnel. It was as though the town itself was being consumed by a presence it couldn't escape. Rebecca Grant arrived in Koppel on a damp, overcast morning, her car kicking up gravel as she pulled into the parking lot of a weathered motel. As an investigative journalist specializing in urban legends, she had heard about Charlie No-Face before, a story passed around in ghost hunting forums and late-night podcasts. But it wasn't until the recent wave of disappearances that she decided to dig deeper. Rebecca had always approached her work with skepticism, believing most legends were born of fear and embellished over time. But there was something about the reports from Koppel that unsettled her. The consistency of the sightings, the strange physical evidence, and the undeniable fear in the voices of those who spoke of the figure, it all felt too real to ignore. After checking into the motel, Rebecca began her investigation by speaking to the locals. She found them reluctant to talk, their faces closing off the moment she mentioned Charlie No Face. At the diner, the waitress simply shook her head and muttered, "You don't want to mess with that." At the gas station, an older man named Hank warned her, "He doesn't like being looked for. Best you keep moving." But not everyone was so guarded. At the edge of town, Rebecca met Abigail Turner, the oldest living resident of Koppel. Abigail lived alone in a sagging farmhouse surrounded by fields of tall grass, her weathered hands tending to a small garden as Rebecca approached. Despite her frail frame, her eyes were sharp, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen more than her share of life's horrors. "You're here about him, aren't you?" Abigail said, her voice steady. Rebecca nodded, pulling out her notebook. "I'm trying to understand who, or what, Charlie No Face really is. Do you know anything about him?" Abigail sighed, setting down her gardening tools. "Everyone in this town knows about him, but knowing doesn't mean understanding. What you're asking about, it's not just a story, it's a wound. And wounds don't heal when you keep picking at them." She invited Rebecca inside, where the walls were lined with faded photographs and shelves crammed with old books. Over a cup of tea, Abigail told her the story of Raymond Robinson, the man who had inspired the legend. Raymond Robinson had been a local boy, Abigail explained, born in the early 1900s. At the age of 8, he suffered a terrible accident while playing near an electrical line, leaving him severely disfigured. His face was melted and unrecognizable, his eyes and nose lost to the burns. For years, Raymond lived in isolation, venturing out only at night to avoid the stares and cruelty of others. He wasn't a monster, Abigail said firmly. He was a man trying to survive in a world that wouldn't look past his scars. But people, they made him into something else. As time passed, stories about Raymond morphed into something darker. People claimed to see him glowing in the darkness. His faceless had an eerie beacon in the night. The hum, some said, was the sound of the electrical energy that had scarred him. And when Raymond died, the stories didn't stop. They grew. "What we call Charlie No Face," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "isn't Raymond. It's something else. Something that was born out of the fear and the hate people directed at him. And it's been feeding on this town ever since." Rebecca left Abigail's house with more questions than answers. The story of Raymond Robinson was tragic, but it didn't explain the glowing figure, the electrical disturbances, or the disappearances. If anything, it deepened the mystery. She decided to visit the Koppel Tunnel, the epicenter of the legend. The drive there was uneventful, the winding road lined with trees that seemed to close in around her car. When she arrived, the tunnel loomed before her like an open mouth, its interior swallowed by darkness. Rebecca parked her car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots the only sound. As she approached the entrance, she felt the air change, cooler, heavier, as though the tunnel were exhaling around her. Inside, the walls were covered in graffiti, much of it referencing Charlie No Face. Warnings scrawled in bold letters read, "Don't look back," and "He sees you." The hum began faintly, a low vibration that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Halfway through the tunnel, Rebecca found something unexpected. A notebook, its cover worn and edges frayed. She opened it to find pages filled with scrawled notes and sketches of a faceless figure, accompanied by descriptions of the hum and glowing lights. The final entry sent a shiver down her spine. "The hum is getting louder. Is here." Rebecca's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and sputtering as the hum grew louder. She felt a sudden chill and turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint glow in the distance, a figure standing motionless at the edge of her light. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the hum grew deafening, seeming to follow her out of the tunnel. When she reached her car, she slammed the door and started the engine, her hands trembling on the wheel. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. In the distance, at the mouth of the tunnel, a faint, glowing figure stood watching her. Rebecca Grant couldn't shake the image of the glowing figure standing at the tunnel's entrance. It lingered in her mind like a shadow, replaying in vivid detail each time she closed her eyes. The hum, the flickering light, and the oppressive cold, everything about the experience defied logic. And yet, she couldn't turn away. The notebook she had found in the tunnel was now spread across the small desk in her motel room. Its pages were filled with chaotic sketches of a faceless figure and notes scrawled in a hand that grew shakier with each entry. The last words haunted her. The hum is getting louder. Is here. Rebecca knew she had to return to the tunnel. The answers she sought were there, buried in the darkness. But this time, she wouldn't go alone. Rebecca enlisted the help of Michael, a local historian and self-proclaimed skeptic she had met at the diner. Michael had spent years researching the town's history and was one of the few people willing to talk openly about Charlie No Face. People like to embellish, Michael said as they drove toward the tunnel. The glowing, the hum, it's all just exaggerated folklore. But the story of Raymond Robinson? That's real. The man suffered, and this town turned him into a monster. The rest is just fear feeding on itself. Rebecca wanted to believe him, but the memory of the glowing figure made her doubt his words. When they arrived, the tunnel looked even more foreboding than before. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the entrance. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, the silence pressing against their ears. Rebecca turned on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the graffiti-covered walls. Michael followed, holding a portable EMF detector that hummed faintly in his hand. "This place gives me the creeps," Michael admitted, his voice echoing. They ventured deeper, the hum growing louder with each step. Rebecca noticed faint scorch marks on the walls, as though fire had licked the stone and left its imprint. The air felt charged, making her hair stand on end. "It's electromagnetic," Michael said, glancing at the detector. "There's definitely something strange going on here, but it's probably just residual energy from the electrical lines that used to run through this area." Rebecca wasn't convinced. The hum felt alive, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Halfway through the tunnel, they found an old, rusted lantern hanging from a hook embedded in the wall. Below it, the ground was littered with scraps of metal, broken glass, and what looked like the remains of a small campfire. "This must have been where someone stayed," Rebecca said, kneeling to examine the debris. Michael frowned, holding up the EMF detector. "The readings are spiking. It's off the charts." Suddenly, Rebecca's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering and fading. The hum grew louder, a low vibration that resonated in their chests. "Do you hear that?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound. Michael nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Before they could move, a faint glow appeared at the far end of the tunnel. It was small at first, like the flicker of a distant flame, but it grew steadily brighter. Rebecca and Michael froze as the figure emerged from the darkness. It was humanoid, its glowing outline casting eerie shadows along the walls. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as though observing them, and its presence seemed to draw the very air from the tunnel. Rebecca's camera, which she had left recording on the ground, began to emit static. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate. "Run," Michael hissed, grabbing Rebecca's arm. They bolted, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The hum followed them, growing louder and more erratic, as though the figure were gaining on them. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The figure was closer now, its glowing form flickering like a dying light bulb. For a brief moment, she thought she saw its hand outstretched toward her. They burst out of the tunnel, gasping for air. The hum ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Back at the motel, Rebecca reviewed the footage from her camera. The video was distorted, filled with bursts of static and flickering images. But there, in the chaos, she saw it. The glowing figure, its faceless head turned toward the camera, and a faint whisper that sent chills down her spine. Why? Michael, visibly shaken, tried to rationalize what they had seen. It's just residual energy, he insisted. A trick of the light, electromagnetic interference. There's no such thing as ghosts. Rebecca didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't just a manifestation of energy. It felt aware, purposeful, and it wasn't finished with them. That night, Rebecca woke to the sound of static. It wasn't coming from the TV or her phone. It was coming from the room itself, as though the air were charged with electricity. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw something that made her blood run cold. At the foot of her bed stood a faint, glowing figure. Its faceless head was tilted, its body flickering like a dying flame. The hum returned, low and resonant, shaking the room as the figure began to move closer. Rebecca scrambled for her camera, but the moment she raised it, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the static-filled hum and the oppressive weight of its presence. She knew then that the legend wasn't just a story. Charlie No-Face wasn't bound to the tunnel. He had followed her, and he wasn't going to stop. The motel room felt colder than it should have, even with the thermostat cranked up. Rebecca sat at the edge of her bed, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest. The figure she had seen at the foot of her bed was no trick of the light, no hallucination brought on by exhaustion. It had been real. The hum still echoed faintly in her ears, a haunting reminder that Charlie No-Face was not confined to the tunnel. Her hands shook as she reviewed the footage from the tunnel. The camera had captured the figure in unsettling clarity, a glowing, faceless silhouette moving toward her and Michael. But what unsettled her more were the whispers. They were faint, buried beneath the static, but they carried a distinct tone, almost like a voice trying to form words. Rebecca knew she couldn't face this alone. She needed answers. The next morning, Rebecca returned to Abigail Turner's farmhouse. The old woman greeted her at the door, her sharp eyes scanning Rebecca's pale face. "You've seen him again, haven't you?" Abigail asked, not waiting for an answer before ushering Rebecca inside. Sitting at Abigail's worn kitchen table, Rebecca recounted the events of the previous night. The glowing figure, the hum, the whispers, all of it spilled out in a torrent of words. Abigail listened silently, her expression grim. "You need to understand," Abigail said finally, her voice low. "Charlie No-Face is not just a man or a ghost. He's something more. Something this town created, whether it meant to or not." Rebecca frowned. "What do you mean?" Abigail reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed photograph. It showed a group of men standing in front of an old electrical substation, their faces solemn. "This was taken in the 1940s, Abigail explained. "Back then, the Koppel Tunnel wasn't just a road. It was part of a larger experiment." She went on to describe how, during World War II, the government had conducted tests in the area, experimenting with electromagnetic fields and their potential applications in communication and warfare. The tunnel, with its unique geological structure, had been a key site for these experiments. "They were trying to bend nature to their will," Abigail said. "And they didn't care about the consequences." Rebecca felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Are you saying Raymond Robinson was a part of this?" Abigail nodded. "He wasn't supposed to be. He was just a boy, playing near the electrical lines. But when the accident happened, it wasn't just electricity that scarred him. It was something else, something that the experiments awakened." Rebecca spent the rest of the day poring over old records in the town's archives. The more she read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The experiments in Koppel had been classified, their details buried in layers of bureaucratic red tape. But scattered among the reports were hints of strange phenomena, unexplained electrical surges, sightings of glowing figures, and accounts of people hearing voices in the static of their radios. One document stood out. It was a report written by a scientist involved in the experiments, describing how electromagnetic fields seemed to amplify human emotions: fear, anger, despair. The report suggested that the energy created by these emotions could take on a physical form, becoming something that lingered long after the experiments ended. Rebecca's heart raced as she read the final line of the report. In the presence of extreme electromagnetic exposure, the barrier between the physical and the metaphysical grows thin. Armed with this new knowledge, Rebecca sought out Michael, who had spent the day recovering from their encounter in the tunnel. She found him at the diner, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. "We were wrong," Rebecca said as she slid into the booth across from him. "Charlie No-Face isn't just a ghost or a legend. He's the product of something this town unleashed." Michael looked skeptical but intrigued. "Unleashed how?" Rebecca explained what she had learned about the experiments, about how the electromagnetic fields might have created a conduit for human fear and despair to manifest physically. "Raymond Robinson's accident wasn't just a tragedy," she said. "It was the spark that lit the fire. His pain, his isolation, and the way the town treated him. It all became fuel for something much bigger." Michael rubbed his temples. "So you're saying this thing, whatever it is, feeds on fear?" Rebecca nodded. "And it's getting stronger. The more people believe in the legend, the more power it has." That night, Rebecca and Michael returned to the tunnel, determined to find the source of the hum. Equipped with cameras, EMF detectors, and a portable audio recorder, they stepped into the darkness once more. The hum began almost immediately, faint but steady, vibrating through the walls. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and their equipment began to malfunction. The EMF detector spiked wildly, its lights flashing in rapid succession. At the far end of the tunnel, they found something neither of them expected. A hidden door, its edges barely visible beneath layers of grime and graffiti. Rebecca pushed it open, revealing a small chamber lined with rusted machinery and old wires that snaked across the walls. At the center of the room stood a tall, cylindrical device, its surface covered in glowing symbols that matched those Rebecca had seen in the notebook. "What is this?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. Rebecca didn't answer. She was drawn to the device, her fingers hovering over its surface. The symbols seemed to pulse with energy, and as her hand brushed against them, a surge of static filled the air. The hum grew louder, deafening now, and the glowing figure appeared in the doorway. Charlie No-Face stood motionless, his faceless head tilted as though watching them. Rebecca felt a wave of terror wash over her, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the hum seemed to shift, its pitch forming a distorted, static-laden whisper. "You, V." Rebecca's flashlight flickered, and the chamber plunged into darkness. The hum reached a crescendo, and the last thing she saw was the figure stepping closer, its glowing hand reaching toward her. The chamber was suffocatingly dark, the hum vibrating through Rebecca's chest as if it were alive. The glow of the cylindrical device cast faint, flickering shadows on the walls, but it was the figure in the doorway that held her frozen in place. Charlie No-Face, his faceless head tilted slightly, seemed almost curious as he took a step closer. Michael grabbed Rebecca's arm, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here, now." But Rebecca didn't move. The whispers that had haunted her for days grew louder, their static-laden tone forming fragments of words. "Fear. Alone. See. What do you want?" Rebecca forced herself to ask, her voice barely audible over the hum. The figure paused, its faceless head tilting further as though it were considering her question. Then, in a burst of light and sound, the cylindrical device surged with energy, and Rebecca was hit with a wave of images. Flashes of Raymond Robinson's life, his pain, his isolation, and the fear he had endured as the town turned him into a monster. The images were overwhelming, a chaotic storm of memories that left Rebecca gasping for air. She saw Raymond wandering the roads at night, his disfigured face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. She felt his despair, his anger, and the energy that had taken root within him, growing stronger with each whispered rumor and fearful glance. The glow from the device dimmed, and Rebecca stumbled back, her mind racing. "It's him," she whispered. "But it's not just him. It's everything he endured. The fear, the pain. It created something bigger than him, something that feeds on all of us." Michael stared at her, his face pale. "You're saying this thing is, what? A manifestation of fear?" Rebecca nodded. "It's not just Charlie No-Face. It's the town, the experiments, the way people treated him. It's everything." The hum grew louder, the whispers building into a deafening cacophony. The figure stepped fully into the room, its glowing form flickering like a broken light. Rebecca felt her legs weaken as it extended a hand toward her. "We can't let it win," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "We have to stop it." Rebecca's eyes fell on the cylindrical device, its symbols glowing faintly. She realized it was the key to everything: the experiments, the energy, and the creature that now stood before them. If she could destroy it, she might sever the connection and end the curse that had plagued Koppel for decades. "Michael," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to shut this thing down." Michael hesitated, his eyes darting between Rebecca and the figure. "Are you insane? We don't even know what it'll do." "We don't have a choice," Rebecca said. "This thing is getting stronger. If we don't stop it now, it'll never end." Rebecca grabbed a metal rod from the floor and swung it at the device. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and the hum grew louder, the symbols on the device flaring with light. The figure let out a distorted scream, its form flickering as though it were unraveling. Michael joined her, smashing the device with a fire extinguisher. Sparks flew, and the air grew heavy with static. The figure lunged toward them, its movements jerky and inhuman, but each strike against the device seemed to weaken it. Finally, with one last blow, the cylindrical device shattered. The hum reached a deafening crescendo before abruptly cutting off, plunging the room into silence. The glowing figure froze, its form flickering one last time before dissolving into the darkness. Rebecca and Michael stumbled out of the tunnel, their breaths ragged and their bodies trembling. The air outside was cool and still, the oppressive energy that had lingered around the area now gone. "Did we do it?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca nodded, though her mind remained heavy with doubt. "I think so." In the days that followed, the town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The hum was gone, and the sightings of Charlie No-Face ceased. But for Rebecca, the experience left an indelible mark. She spent hours reviewing the footage from the tunnel, hoping to find answers. The video captured the glowing figure, the whispers, and the destruction of the device. But in the final frame, as the figure dissolved, Rebecca noticed something chilling. For a brief moment, the static on the screen formed a single word: alone. Months later, Rebecca returned to the Koppel tunnel to film the final segment of her documentary. The area was quiet, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. As she stood at the tunnel's entrance, her camera recording, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Just as she was about to leave, a faint hum reached her ears. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the familiar sound grew louder. Rebecca turned toward the tunnel, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Deep within the darkness, a faint glow appeared, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Rebecca's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in darkness. The hum grew deafening, and the last thing she heard before everything went silent was a single, distorted whisper. "Still here."